they have anything to do with either environment, natural world, or traditional knowledge in whatever sense they have. And if I had to synthesize what I've learned from them, is that they want to do this listing. They have this pathological need to collect and list, like the 19th century European encyclopedists. Let's move out into the world and gather into our boxes and cages and steamer trunks all possible species and people and all kinds of things, and measure them and print out categorize them, make tables and so on and so on. This is something that I don't know, it's their identity in some strange way. But that is one part. The other part is, again, ultimately, it will be, if it is allowed to continue, if we are not successful in stopping it, in identifying it and stopping it, it will be very destructive because of what I just mentioned about the process of describing. Definition of intangible cultural heritage. Yes. So that emerges from what is in quotes.
It's a UN convention on.
Yeah. So that is
their answer to.
Yeah.
It's their answer to what is intangible.
Yeah. So that, according to UNESCO, this is what intangible cultural heritage is. All those things about traditional arts and social practice, rituals, etc. Those are broken up into 5 domains of intangible cultural heritage or living cultural heritage. And this is again something that I had a lot of difficulty with. In fact, I was extremely annoyed with the Ministry of Culture here in Delhi for going ahead with stupidly, I mean idiotically, with Kumbh Mela. With Kumbh Mela as intangible cultural heritage. And I wrote to them saying, what the hell is wrong with you? I mean, why are you even doing this? Just leave it alone, for God's sake. Because they load onto themselves this pressure that let us have in our agency pipeline, in the UN agency pipeline, a number of dossiers which keeps us busy. The whole bureaucratic imperative which keeps us busy. And then if 1 out of 6 or 7 of them succeed, then we are in clover for the next 3 to 4 years. We don't have to do anything.
Also, they really try to commercialize these things by listing them in these.
They do, certainly, for the smaller countries. They do.
Something going to the UNESCO site list. Like what happens? What like why people aim? Okay, we need Kumbh Mela on this. What is the whole idea behind it? Maybe the bureaucratic mind unwrapping it. What is it?
Sushant, the bureaucratic mind couldn't care less whether it's Kumbh Mela or whether it's some tokery sitting somewhere. They just want to be able to put it, to describe it in a 12 or 13 page format, send it to UNESCO,
There is a set format for this.
There is a set format for this. There is a set format for this. Good question. Countries can apply.
Because I know heritage sites get funding.
Countries can apply for funding to do the nomination process itself, which is something, again, that I found absurd and extraordinary. That means you're asking me, if I'm an indigenous community sitting somewhere in Borneo, my national government is asking me to help with the description of something which I can't use my own language, I have to use yours, which is not even yours, it comes from UNESCO, and for which you are taking money from UNESCO to do this in order that what you write, not what I write, I tell you something, you write something else, what you write will be put on a UNESCO on a UNESCO list, which will be distributed then worldwide, and at the end of it, I have no idea what that will do to me, that whole process, and that the end product, which is the listing, what is it going to do to me, to my clan, to my tribe, to my community? I have no idea whatsoever. So, I mean, again, I have to say what I've been telling you since yesterday is, the result of long and often tortuous thinking on my part about what am I doing with this agency, what is this agency doing, and do I have any role in this whole thing? And I mean, I have to say, I would completely candidly admit to you that this began to happen only around 2015-16 to me, which, as I told Rahulji, then I decided I really didn't want to have much to do with anymore. Let's remove UNESCO from this. Let's say all UN agencies which have anything to do with traditional knowledge or with environment, or with both, because a number of them do. You know, FAO I stepped out of. I mean, I'm still connected to that Committee on Food Security through that consultative thing, but I don't do anything because it has become meaningless. FAO, right from the start, right from the time that I got to know it, has been heavily controlled by the food MNCs and by the global fertilizer companies, and what used to be the clutch of agri-commodity traders. There used to be three big ones: Archer Daniel Midlands, Louis Dreyfus, and Bunga. And these are, at that time, this was in the 2008-9. Some of them are still there in the original form. Some of them are split, mergers, acquisitions, and all that. But they are controlled by these three entities a great deal. And of course, no, there's a fourth, which is the ag-biotech industry. So when these four controlling forces in FAO began exerting huge pressure on the consultative system to the CFS, the Committee on Food Security, that's when I said, look, there's no place for small fry like me here. I certainly can't make my voice heard beyond where this forum will allow me to. So why bother participating in it at all? All of them do this wherever they have anything to do with either environment, natural world, or traditional knowledge in whatever sense they have. If I had to synthesize what I've learned from them, is that they want to do this listing. They have this pathological need to collect and list, like the 19th century European encyclopedists. Let's move out into the world and gather into our boxes and cages and steamer trunks all possible species and people and all kinds of things, and measure them and print out categorize them, make tables and so on and so on. This is something that I don't know, it's their identity in some strange way. But that is one part. The other part is, again, ultimately, it will be, if it is allowed to continue, if we are not successful in stopping it, in identifying it and stopping it, it will be very destructive because of what I just mentioned about the process of describing. That they are taking away the power that you have, which is your inalienable right to describe yourself in a matter that you choose or your community chooses in a language that you want.
This definition is a good example of they doing it for us.
So not only that.
Tangible cultural message from our lives.
Well, Ojasvi, it took me a while to begin to confront this term itself. I just took it at face value and said, okay, intangible cultural heritage is something that I understand better as traditional knowledge. If UNESCO wants to use this term, let's just go with it. But then, especially in the field, and you know what I was saying about in the field. In the field, I must tell you this what we did in both in Sri Lanka and in Cambodia. What they wanted, there was a particular phase when they wanted, they have this mania for collecting. So they wanted phrases that would correspond to intangible cultural heritage in all the countries in which this capacity building was being done, which happened to be all over the world. This was a completely meaningless exercise, because all they had at the end of it was, 120 odd phrases in different scripts and languages, performative camouflage, or in this, and to do what? To show that we have covered so many different scripts and languages and peoples. But I think, it was quite distasteful to me in a way, because what did it do at the same time? What it did is that it was an attempt to convince people that, look, this thing, conceptual thing that you have, which we are calling intangible cultural heritage, our concept and term and label for it is superior to what you have, because we are a global authority in this particular subject. And if you don't have it, that only proves our superiority. So we are supplying you with one. And this is really what they did. If the community capitulated and said, yes, we'll accept your term, then I think they were already had taken the first step on a slippery slope, because then they would capitulate to the accepting the method of describing themselves and their work and their knowledge and their thought and their cosmology and all the rest of that as well. Whereas intrinsically, I would automatically lean the other way and say, look, if you as a UN agency or any other kind of agency which is interested in this want to know it better, then you spend time understanding as best you can how they describe themselves and why they do, and what their cosmologies and philosophies are. And then if you want, you translate it in a way that you can make some sense out of it. And then you run your commentaries based on that. But don't tamper with the original. They present themselves as the global authority, but then they bring to bear the pressure of the entire UN system on a hapless administration or ministry in a small country to say that we are the global authority and we are providing you with methods which you are not competent to invent yourself. We shouldn't even reach the stage of giving validation. We should say, look, what is, as I said, even with what I've been developing as the guardian gates of Indic thought, that how do we approach what modernity is throwing at us and wants us to accept? Where do we stop and say, no, look, this is enough. Let us first understand what this will do to us before deciding how much to accept of it. So with material things as much as with immaterial things. In this case, this has not happened. We have, because it's terminology and because it is connected to the authoritative UN system, whose authoritativeness, by the way, has been facilitated in no small degree by the country administration or ministry. Then what has happened thereafter is that then we have ceded control of our own language, use of our own language and descriptors to give them control. When that happens, the following generation stops using the indigenous terms and uses the borrowed term. And this is what I started seeing happen, and it really worried me. But this thing about the adoption of global heritage and the also the recognizing, to my mind, the illegitimately recognizing authority of the UN agency for whichever ministry. Probably in 17, I think, when I began to to organize my thoughts and about this whole matter, I wrote to the Ministry of Culture. To Secretary, Assistant Secretary, and Head of IGNC and so on, saying that, look, this is what I've observed. I don't see any reason why we are spending money and spending time and effort on doing this, on subscribing to this whole listing activity, which is carried out by the UNESCO cultural conventions. If at all listing is required and therefore recognition is required, that should be local, i.e. at a national level or provincial level, whatever you like, through using a means that we derive from our own understanding of what this means to us and what it symbolizes, and without having to strain and exert ourselves in the one direction of tangible and another direction of intangible, which anyway has no meaning to us. To dissociate language from culture and say that, yes, we understand that your language is now spoken by only 250 people, but we can't do anything to save it because it's not part of what our convention does. I mean, what kind of explanation is that? What UNESCO says in response is that, oh, we treat languages separately through our program, which is called, what is the program called? Something about the Atlas of Endangered Languages, or the Roster of Endangered Languages, something like that, which is in fact nothing more than a sorry record of how true cultural protection has, at the international level, has in fact failed and continues to fail at a much faster rate. That is what it is. Because if you do not see, if you are saying that you are interested through your organization to protect any sort of cultural expression or manifestation or practice, and you say that I will do only this but not language, then I would say that your approach is null and void. Because what medium are you going to use? You're certainly going to use a medium that is alien to the very people whose expressions, rituals, practices, etc. You are setting out to save. So what is going to be your medium of discourse? One would automatically assume that it does have that much importance, because either that it does have that much importance, which we will arrive at through a process of discussion and understanding, or that we keep it open-ended and then let the knowledge-bearing community set out what it feels are areas that need immediate attention, urgent attention, and then longer-term things. But neither of these, which you would think is the common sense way to go about it, is actually adopted. You see, whatever they have on endangered languages doesn't reduce their endangerment in no way. What it does is simply points out that 10 years ago, such and such language in this part of Timor had 800 speakers, and to the best of our knowledge, last year when we did a survey, now it's come down to 500. And they'll change the color of the indicator from orange to red. And that's it. What is done for it, we don't know. Whatever is done at the local level, if at all anything is done, will then hopefully, and if the slide, the disuse has been arrested, on at least reversed a little bit, in the next survey, then from red it will turn back to orange, and then the UN program will say, look, we've managed to do this. What we mentioned earlier, the credit hogging part. So this is generally the approach that they take. But you see, as Gayatri correctly identified, this it's a you can't call it the trivialization of language. You have to call it the expropriation of an indigenous form of communication and description, and its replacement by as a convoluted bureaucracies, which then becomes the idiom in which even the Ministry of Culture starts to talk to its lesser constituents. Oh, we've done capacity building. Oh, we have successfully filled in the requests for criteria to do a nomination, and so on. So this becomes part of their language and part of their official documents themselves, based on which then they run programs at the, let's say, state or provincial level. So when that happens, then we have the propagation really of vague and alien terminology, which sooner or later, and in fact in some of these cases it has happened sooner, which makes its way into the districts. When it makes its way into the districts, then of course the disintegration goes on at a much faster rate. Yeah, so this is certainly a big part of the danger. Well, as I was saying, Timor was full of UN agencies, and I think our UNESCO work attracted more older ones because older ones had more things to say and said it in a more weighty way. Of course, we had a lot of youngsters as well, but all the other agencies were there. In Timor-Leste, you see, what had happened is that after their independence, which was in 2001, I think, for about 10 years,
Portuguese of Indonesia.
no, Indonesian occupation. The Portuguese was prior to the Indonesian.
And you were reporting to the Indonesian office itself?
No, I was reporting I was working with the UNESCO Indonesia office, which administered Timor-Leste also, and to the UNESCO Bangkok office, which is the Asia regional office, and then to the headquarters in Paris because of the donor, which I think in Timor's case at that period was the Japan Funds and Trust, which I mentioned. No, not JICA. I mean, JICA was always looming around in the background, but it was a separate fund which was set up.
It's in Paris.
Who? No, the funds are kept in Paris, presumably.
One has to admire the complexity of the structure. Just
They're brilliant at it. The matter of making a living out of the, if we call it a handicraft or if we call it a performative art, or even if you call it, which is something that I tried very hard to make UNESCO understand and even UNDP understand, which is that we have so many scientific arts relating to the practices of man in a location, in that particular location, which has to deal with the substances and materials of nature and shaping that nature, which takes a variety of forms, in fact. So there are, the French, in fact, and the Italians have a word for it, which is a shaped landscape, a tended landscape, a nurtured landscape, from which they derive, of course, crops. But the tending to that landscape becomes a scientific art because there are so many of these elements of understanding soil, stone, the action of water, what sort of crops can be used, what sort of crops can't be used, how to mix them, and so on, which in fact is present in so many parts of the world. Some of the most, I think, picturesque of these kind of shapings of landscape are seen in the terraced rice valleys of whether of Northeast India, which I used to be fascinated and love, but also in parts of Sumatra, Java, parts of the southern Philippines, and so on. So we have all these, and in fact, even where I live, which Sushant has a yearning to come to, but perhaps this year, which is in Goa, where the riverine estuarine systems are entirely shaped by the hand of man, entirely. So this is, I think, a scientific art which the UN and multilateral agencies and other organizations struggle to understand, perhaps cannot understand. In some way, I don't really blame them, because unless you live in it or unless you have a deep desire to understand it, you will not. So I was talking about these shaped landscapes only to give you a third category beyond handicrafts, beyond performative and ritual arts, and give you this third category, which I particularly like, simply because I think it's underrepresented and under-recognized as well. Partly for the reasons that I said, which is that unless you have a bent of mind which can understand the spiritual connection between the hand of man and the substance of nature as it has been caused to appear to us in this loka, then you will certainly find it difficult. And this is, I think, what Sushant was asking for, is that in our cultures, and in fact in several of the Southeast Asian and Eastern cultures, and generally in the Asian cultures, including those of North Asia, which again, thanks to the UNESCO programs I was able to visit.
You're referring to the Southeast Asian and North Asian cultures.
Right. So, we often talk about Southeast Asia, East Asia, but North Asia is just as important, because those are the steppe areas, which I was able to see again firsthand when I went to Mongolia for this sort of work, which is really a dimension of space which you cannot I find it very hard to describe, because the steppes are vast and the sky above the steppes is equally vast. And when and it's of a blue that defies description. And you look up there, I certainly looked up there and I thought that, my gosh, this is what the body of Krishna is. This is truly it. And they see it and they live under it every day.
Because in Mongolian shamanism, which is deeply connected with nature, they embody or they anthropomorphize the same sky as
So
everything.
that is Tengiri.
Tengiri,
yes.
the father itself.
Yes. So Tengiri. So, but anyway, we can discuss that a little bit more. So in all these parts of Asia, what we call Asia, there is, I think, this underlying current that not this underlying current, in fact, it's very overt in most areas, where we consider and we treat the elements as living. And we treat the shapes, forms, and characteristics of the elements as they have been caused to appear to us also as living. And therefore, the transformations that we subject them to become, in a way, our shaping of offerings that return to the great Paramatma, to the great Brahman. And my view has been that if we see handicraft, Hastkala, the expression of performative arts, the shaping of our landscapes, all of which are sacred, in this light, then in fact what we are saying is that every action of ours which is imbued with this sort of mind and has these characteristics of beauty and devotion are in fact divine acts, or acts that bring divinity closer to us and in order to surround us. And if we are able to understand handicraft, however apparently mundane and simple it appears to be, even in a small tokri that is used to transport vegetables, or a small kullad from which we drink chai, or a simple woven bag in which we carry some odds and ends, to the objects that are given much more lavished, upon which care and attention are lavished, which goes all the way up to the murtis that we install in our mandirs, then we see that there is a continuum of treating the elements in the same way and with the same reverence. So as to your question is about whether this can be mechanized, certainly it cannot. This cannot be mechanized, nor should it be. Design then becomes what we take to be design, which is the recognition of a pattern, which there is no pattern which does not come out of nature, what nature has already drawn and shown to us. And in fact, we will do a small walk. I have already planned where to go within 200 meters over here, and I'll show you this. There is no pattern which nature has not already created from its immeasurable storehouse of patterns, each of which describes the shapes of the great unknown and the divinity that surrounds the great unknown, and has caused it to appear to us so that we see it that way and treat it that way. And perhaps, and this is what I meant yesterday, that we are surrounded by millions upon millions of signs and symbols that appear to us throughout the living day, provided we choose to live in the nature that is beaming to us these signs and symbols, and not in a cement ghetto somewhere. I don't know whether whether we fail or we don't have, because I think this comes out spontaneously. I think that if for example, if we were to bring a group of young children here and give them pencil and paper and say, go out there and just put down what you like, I feel that they will instinctively go towards the leaf forms and the seed forms and draw them, because this is something that we carry in our living memories from ages ago. I feel so, but then other than a few so-called experimental schools who are doing this. So this is also relates to what I was saying earlier about this communication between what we call nature and us, which has no language, and which then is reproduced because we want to reproduce it. We are so taken by it, we are so absorbed by it, we are so entranced by it. We want to reproduce it. We want to use it to adorn us. We want to use it to decorate and make our houses pretty, our homes pretty. We want to use it to make our public spaces more redolent of these messages. So we take them and turn them into patterns. And when we take them and turn them into patterns, we weave them into our fabric so that we can cloak ourselves in it and in a way perhaps gain some of the energies and some of the shaktis that come out of these patterns, because they are all coming out of them. So this is the way that I see this, the patterning and patternings of handicraft. I feel that it is certainly done. It is done at a level of individual and maybe household and perhaps tribal activity. But as to it being turned into an input for a mass process, there I feel that then you are, I think, degrading the significance. I think so. My answer to you would be that when we allow it to be degraded, that is when we have lost it. For example, even I'm not sure about other parts of India, because at that particular point during Ganesh festival, I've not really seen it. I mean, Ganesh Chaturthi to Visarjan is such a big part of the Konkan. So we've seen, certainly I've seen elderly ladies take a little bit of mud from anywhere, fashion it to something that doesn't look at all like what you would call Ganesh. But to her fingers and to her eyes and mind, this is Ganesh. And then she will bring the flowers and everything, do everything. And then that is Ganesh. Because she has caused it to be Ganesh. So it is the same thing for us, that you take a pattern and it needn't be the finished pattern. Nature never has a finished pattern. All nature's patterns are incremental differences from one another. Each seed, a tree will shed thousands of seeds over the spell of 2 or 3 days. And if you look at them as a glimpse of 100 seeds, they all look alike, but in fact they're just like snowflakes. There are minute differences in all. So there is no repetitive pattern in nature either. So we could say that this is the tree's expression of reverence to Paramatma. There's so many ways to look at it. But what I'm trying to get at is that the handmade handicraft, or the handmade art, the handmade fabric art, the handmade basket art, the handmade mud and earth arts, when they use patterns, when they use textures, then these become part of the same reverential approach to the forces of creation, Shakti and devotion that we see surrounding us in nature. And so I think it is important for us, for all those who work in any part of handicrafts, Hastakala, to attempt to reduce the gap between what nature does as its as giving diksha versus what we do. Because if we consider this, for example, the reproduction or the copying or the translation of a natural pattern into a texture or a fabric, then we are approaching this the same way, or we should be approaching this the same way. When we approach it the same way, or even when we try to, then I feel that we are paying homage to the Mahabhuta in the way that we are meant to. Because these are living elements and because we are treating them with something approaching the same reverence that the primal form of the elements, which is not us, I mean, which is not us in that form, which is the green world, the vegetative world, but also the rock world and the mineral world, with something approaching the reverence that they do. There is certainly a supramental intelligence that is underlying the this endless, inconceivably endless profusion of patterns and textures with which we are surrounded by, if we choose to be surrounded by it. In the artificial world of cement and glass and chrome and all those other steel sheets and whatnot, we don't get that. We cannot get that because that is a monoculture of patterns and textures. And that monoculture of patterns and textures does nothing but, in fact, divorce us from this supramental intelligence. So, in the same way, the northeast region, the what used to be the Chota Nagpur region of the Gonds, what I'm getting at is wherever basketry is done as a daily and a routine practice. And I have these old photographs from the northeast of master basket makers who are given they provide the specifications to the younger that there must be 12, 13, 14, 15 knots to the inch. I'm using inch, but they have a different measure altogether, which describe the fineness of the basket. Even though they have a let us call it a template, every single one is different, and it has to be, because that is the nature of handicraft, and that is the beauty of handicraft. So my kurta will be similar to hers but never the same, and therefore in each there is a different expression, which then is a construct of your personality and your apparel, your personality and your basket, your personality and your agricultural implement, even if it is simply just a hoe or a spade or something like that. So these become living objects. We wear them, we handle them. So if we look at it in this way, then the very notion of handicraft takes on a completely different meaning. So if you think back at what we've talked about now and bring in mechanization and industrialization, then those become ugly distortions. This has been the plea of whichever group or community that has produced something beautiful. But by beautiful, I don't mean something like an artwork but even to me, even which I carry, I must show you my you have a traveling toilet bag, I suppose, kind of thing. And I'll show you my traveling toilet bag, which is in tatters, but it's a small basket from Nagaland, which I've been carrying with me to stuff all sorts of things in, including my toothbrush, toothpaste and all that, for years. It's very durable, but now it's beginning to fall apart. So to protect it, I put it in another cloth bag. But to me, that is beautiful. That's why I want it there with me when I travel. Because if it's not there, I feel uncomfortable because it has a presence within my immediate personal sphere. But it has that presence only because it's handmade. So I was saying that there's always this plea, this repetitive, inevitable plea from every single small group, whatever they make, that yes, we want to make this. Of course, we would like to continue, but once our old people go, who can teach this, and once the young people are moved or driven or herded into different jobs, into the industrial, into a factory or services sector or whatever you call it, then who will be left to do it? And therefore, whatever you propose, it needs to be made viable now so that they don't go somewhere else. And to my mind, that should it be made viable in order to prevent them from being snatched away by somewhere else? I mean, how do we do that? If, on the other hand, we bring in a mode of subsidization which then enslaves them to viability, will we be doing good? So this is really a big conundrum, I feel. On the other hand, it is a conundrum only if we limit ourselves to thinking along the models that have already been prescribed and given to us. And if we do not, then of course the conundrum disappears. So we must not. In certainly in Thailand and Cambodia, Malaysia, where I have seen the silk arts ranging right from, so there will be some kind of group or collective or NGO or commercial organization which will run the silk farm. So with the silkworm, the cocoons, the whole lot, until the spinning of the yarn, it's dyeing, and then putting it on the looms, turning it into a fabric, and using the patterns and so on, repetitive patterns. Then these become works of high quality silk, which then are beautifully packaged, monogrammed, given descriptions on lovely paper, printed and so on, and are then sold in the what are they called? High fashion shops or whatever they're called. You know what I mean? Boutique type kind of things. To tourists and the well-heeled of that particular society at very high prices. And in some cases, I would say the profit from these sales are used in order to preserve the art. So this entire setup is taken as being as symbolizing the success of commercializing a handicraft form or an art form in order to ensure the survivability of the tradition. If you look at it at the surface, it appears so, but if I recall all the notes that I made when I visited these places and I talked to some of these people who, and if I wish I really had some of those photographs of some of these silkworm, these silk farms. Certainly, these people are bringing their tradition in. Certainly, they're from a ethnic group or community which represents this. But I don't see them as being any more than factory workers, but in a much more pleasant setting. So, in that sense, I find it not appealing at all, because it has taken their inheritance of an art, but placed it in what is essentially a modern industrial setting, driven by modern industrial impulses, but which are given the gloss of being new age, new methods, a new dispensation that appreciates the transformation of tradition into what the modern market wants, that we care about this and so on. It has the scent of falsity to it. Why should we condemn the younger generation to struggle through as a deeper struggle for them than what we experienced in order to satisfy the desires of an outside group? So I certainly agree with that. What I do think is that I think in this whole rush towards modernity and this gallop away from poverty and malnutrition and all the rest of that, we have not stopped to think about what are the other methods that can be employed other than the industrial and other than the humdrum traditional. By humdrum traditional, I mean the state sponsor taking over the role of the aristocracy, the state sponsor taking on the role of the royal patronage, but the state sponsor is not equipped to see what the royal patronage did. So we kind of wobble back and forth endlessly between one and the other model, and I think it's really high time that we try to look at what else is there. I mean, certainly it's been thought about any number of times earlier, and there's so many forms of what are they called, cooperatives and collectives and artist collectives and so on and so forth. But we really don't know whether they have been successful over a duration. What generally happens is that somebody interested, I mean, not only media but anybody who's interested goes and conducts an interview or a short film, and then you see this, and that the seeing of that film or the reading of that interview persists over some time, and you believe that yes, it is successful, but we don't know whether it is because we never go and revisit those people and their situations. We certainly don't, and this is what was brought home to me in a very blunt manner a few years ago when I went to Pune. So I was staying in a hotel somewhere near Ruby Hall, and the morning that I checked out, there was this northeastern girl at the counter, and it turned out she was from Nagaland, which is a place that I know very well because I did quite a bit of my northeast work in Nagaland. So as we finished signing whatever it was, and I told her that I was chatting with her about which district she came from, where her parents were, and so on. And I told her I would, you've given me poha to eat and chai to drink, but I would so much like a meal of job steers. Now, job steers is a particular kind of millet which grows up in the Naga hills. And she said, she smiled at me, but she looked a bit blank. So I said, surely you get job steers here in Pune? I mean, even though it's Pune. Turned out she had no idea what job steers meant. She just didn't know. And this is what I think is something that, in our wobbling back and forth between the state subsidy and the new age marketing methods, if we don't revisit periodically what is the outcome of either one of these or any experiment in between, then we lose touch with what has been lost touch with, especially for that generation. We can't see it anymore because we haven't revisited them. Of course, this is such a huge country, how do we even start? But wherever you start, if you go back and see that did this experiment work and for how long, if we don't do that, I don't think we can get any answers. Because this is something that used to trouble me certainly during my UNESCO years, but also the FAO years when documenting traditional cultivation practices. That we look at it here at this point in a timeline, and then we extract whatever we can understand from it at that particular point. But 2, 3, 4 seasons later, perhaps after one young person has left, perhaps after one old uncle has passed away, then what is the condition of it? We don't revisit it. If we don't revisit it, we have no idea of understanding what sort of approach to it might work. And this is also what has plagued state sponsorship and state subsidy-based sponsorship from the time it began. That they have looked at this as a continuing approach, unmindful of the changes that have occurred, of the broader macroeconomic changes, and also unmindful of the locational changes that have occurred to that particular group or community. So NREGA started off with, presumably with a bang, and within about 2.5 years, I think, a number of small organizations, because there are thousands and thousands who are working on rural development in India all over the place, and they said, look, NREGA may be good or bad, we don't know. But the reason we don't know is because any NREGA activity is treated only as a budget and a labor plan and some kind of outcome which takes the shape of a paragraph written here and filed off in some report. And what sense do we make out of that? So they said, let's bring in something which is called a social audit. So this somehow grabbed the attention of the administrators, I think, because they saw it as a way to demonstrate their commitment to rural development in the first place. That look, we think about things in a loving and devoted manner, so we will commission social audits. So the commissioning of social audits itself became a sub-industry within NREGA. And And then they became this registration system for those organizations which were considered to be qualified to do social audits. So that became a sub-yojana within NREGA in order to, even before any social audit was done. So this became, looking back, the kind of feverish activity that I saw about simply the organizing of social audits, not even its carrying out. Contests between organizations, groups at the grassroots, between who would become the social auditor, who would be reported to, the jockeying for budgets for carrying out those. So, again, this was an example at a very large scale of, I think, the projectivitis taking over a process of internal checks and balance. But of course, I realize, I've slipped into, you see, what I was saying, which I think I enjoyed telling you about, which is the meanings that we absorb from what nature tells us, which really ought to imbue anything that we do with our hands, and which we try in some way to channel our spiritual self through. This is something that somehow, I don't know how, this is what we have to discuss and perhaps carry on from here. But if we are able to keep even a small bit of this still alive, no, why should we be miserly about it? Let's keep a big bit of it alive. What I'd want to talk about, which I think was the overview of the UN multilateral organization mind, and then give you a demo of what it becomes in practice. I think the overview part you would already be able to think about based on our conversations of the last 2 days. But for the overview part, I had wanted to read something out, but which I think I'll defer that because that will disturb our trend of thought for the morning. I'll defer that to post lunch. But the demo of what it becomes in practice, I think that's what I wanted to show you through 2 presentations. And the reason I wanted to show you is because one of those presentations is very much a continuation of our discussion throughout this morning, whereas the other one isn't, and it cannot be. And one of them comes from the UN system, and the other one is my own, which was done on behalf of the UN, in the UN system setting. So, in a way, a radical act, which I felt I had to do because using what the UN system prescribed, I simply could not connect to the people who were there who had come for this. There was no way they could understand this. This is the approach that I followed through most of the second half of my tenure with UNESCO, that I would make what I thought was required to be communicated, make it myself, so that the message at least would be a genuine message and not, not one that was the result of this UN-ML organization mind, which is impossible for anybody who comes from a handicrafts community or an ethnic group or any sort of background that we do to look at and make sense of, because there's no connection whatsoever with our lives. I must tell you, in practice, though, that this became increasingly more and more difficult because, just like I was describing yesterday about these formats and forms and so on, we also, as functionaries of a UN agency, were expected to operate from day to day and session to session, following a particular format, what we would present, how we present it, in which sequence, and so on, with no regard whatsoever given to who are the people to whom you are delivering this, and what is their receptivity to what you are delivering. There was no regard given to this whatsoever, which to my mind was in the first place a waste of their time. Why are we bringing them here for them to listen to something which has no meaning or bearing on their life? And so this is a sort of way that I had to devise in order to get the message through. Now, what I'm going to show you here is, what I'm going to show you here is if you like, you can read the words and, read the words yourself. But the point is, I'd like to show you the typical, what I mentioned earlier, the organization mind of the UN multilateral system is delivered a lot in these kind of presentations. It's delivered a great deal through these kind of presentations. And these kind of presentations are made to all audiences, regardless of the kind of people those audiences are composed of. Their assumption being that this is important enough, earth-shattering enough for everybody to pay attention to and absorb in some way. This particular PPT has to do with what this intangible cultural heritage is and how this convention undertakes the safeguarding. And in the various training courses that I had to give over the period of 10 to 11 years, the number of these training modules expanded from about 5 or 6 to more than 60 over this duration. And I'll get back to that particular thought either later this afternoon or tomorrow as to why this happens, because this is very much a symptom of that UN-ML mind, which is to bombard to the extent that it overwhelms you so that you don't have the conceptual space to develop what you need to develop for your own self. And this is a realization that I came to myself by around 2015 or so, 16. Why are we doing all this when, if we are saying safeguarding of a heritage form or function or expression, then we need to be asking, we don't need to be prescribing. So this is the general, the shape and form of this projection of authority. So it goes like this. There's references to articles of a convention or of a treaty or of an international negotiated instrument and so on. So you see, this is very much the subject. What is the currency of the UN-ML system? It's all these things. What are written in the articles of a treaty? So you see, if you read the language used, it's very self-referential. What are we giving you? We are giving you the justification for the actions that you will undertake as an obligation of your country to the UN agency. So where am I? Where is my community? Where is what I do? None of that is there. Look at what is highlighted. The necessary measures. Do states need to? So the necessary measures is what the authority, or then the delegation of authority is then given in a very constrained sense by the UN agency to the state, to the national administration or the national ministry. This is the subtext reading of what I'm showing you, and so on. This again is, so let me just go through it. So this is, if you look at these: identification, inventorying, documentation, research, revitalizing, protecting, encouraging, awareness raising, and so on. These are all hot button words. These are words and concepts with which you can't really have an argument or an opposition. Yes, we of course we agree with this. Naturally this has to be done. This is why we are here. So these pop in at appropriate times to reinforce the message that of course we are good people, we are a good organization, we are there to benefit whatever you have and so on. We just like you to accept the larger package so that you get these little hot button tickle points. So, statements like these are vague generalities, but then they become currency, or they become phrases that the national administration then becomes accustomed to use in its own way, even in its own language. So it will translate this into, Sinhalese or Mongolian or Farsi or whatever it is, and begin to use these as if they make sense to one another, and especially as if they make sense to the communities that they're talking to, the knowledge bearers they're talking to. There's no discussion as to, in the first place, whether this makes sense at all, or whether we should adopt something that is given to us as a package of terminologies from any other agency, and why we don't have our own and we use our own instead. There's no negotiation about this whatsoever. Everywhere you will see in all kinds of communication, from a UN agency to national administration, whatever the subject, culture to forestry to environment to education to children, women, so on. There are constant references, as you see here. See article this, see ODs. ODs means operational directives. Consider ethical principle. What is this ethical principle? This ethical principle happened because all these UN agencies do this. They convene committees which will draft the ethical principles along which that UN agency works, things like that. So there are constant references to these bits of text which are supposed to be the product of the deliberations of the intergovernmental system, which is the multilateral system. So what they do is they're always trying to tell you that, look, this is the result of a great concourse of minds that has come together to give you the best of what the world has to offer, which happens to be distilled through us and by us and presented to you. So for the national administration, usually they are completely overawed by this. And that is the idea, to overawe you. You know what in the Gulf War used to be called shock and awe. It is exactly that, but turned into this, the overmind of the UN multilateral system. Then this particular presentation then goes into making it known that we have all these wonderful examples of heritage around the world. With this, they are already, in fact, giving you the instruction, and this is what I was saying about the tyranny of protocol. They're giving you the instruction of how to arrange your thinking in order to be able to acceptably report back to the UN agency. So this is one part. This is what I wanted you to see. So you get a sense of this is in fact the fundamental kind of communication between the UN agency and anybody it talks to, whether it's a national administration or community representatives or NGOs or the private sector, whoever it is. This is the general look and feel. So this was my workaround in almost every case, every training that I did, every policy advice that I did. This was my workaround. I would make up my own messages and simply not tell the agency about it. What I wanted to show you with these two presentations is the typical voice of a UN agency to whatever the audience is. The way I saw it is that the message was important, and your authoritativeness and your cracking the whip about where the chain of command is, that has to be kept out of it. But of course, that's something that they would never accept. So I simply agreed to take these missions on. But the central message, which was in my hands to deliver, I would deliver it in this way. So it's not that this represents everything. Each had its own context, and so there were dozens that I made like this, dozens. So I would use a lot of images from the field, by the field I went, the field that I was familiar with, whatever rural work I had done, and invariably found that there would be a lot of correspondences. People would say, yes, I can see we have that kind of tree also, we use this also. So that created an immediate connect in people, minus all this jargon, which really got in the way. I mean, it was two different universes of communication that were operating here. So you see this also. So I would use this as reinforcements that, look, we are representing an effort that does understand you. And I had to do this because if I did the other method, I would never get anything across. Bring out photographs that I had taken from during my work with Center for Environment Education, where this was somewhere in Uttarakhand, I think. This was part of a panchayat meeting to show that, look, we're talking about normal people here, ordinary people doing their ordinary rural lives. simple handicrafts. This is in fact the Kondapalli dolls. Yeah. Just as an aside, the sad thing about this Kondapalli is, there's a particular softwood, and because of this creeping or rather galloping urbanization there, the softwood stands have been getting cut down, so they don't have enough wood now to make these dolls. So I would use a lot of images like this. Now, this was from Cambodia. This was a dance school. Again, use of simple language, short messages. I always did underline this because I needed them to think about it and tell their national administrations, look, this doesn't make sense to us unless you include this. So this was the way I would, provide subliminal messages that start thinking about this, so that you mention it, so that we record it and send it back. So anyway, you get the idea. This in fact was from Timor-Leste. This was one of the outlying towns. Yeah, notice these baskets. So these baskets were used in Timor-Leste as a way to transport the produce to the market, but beautiful, and this is something that I would have to use images like this to make that message clear that, look, these are mundane objects, but that those mundane objects have a daily use, and if you exchange those daily use mundane objects for plastic, you're going to be left with a big problem of disposal and so on. And in this way, I was able to at least slide in the environmental messages. This is Kerala. This is there's this village on the banks of the Pamba, which is called Aranmulla, the Pamba River, which starts on Sabrimala. And the reason I used this to explain a very important concept was this part. Here, see this part. So this is an offering to Parthasarthi, but that rice, those rice stalks with the grain there, that has to be grown in the neighboring wetlands. And there was a whole story about that. So that is the reason, what I mentioned. That is when I understood that this rice that you see here on the right is not from the neighboring area. This is what they brought from Tamil Nadu. So at that point, what I did tell them was, here, this was in Kerala, that look, in my humble view, I don't think Parthasarthi would appreciate this very much, because he expects to be fed with rice that you've grown just outside the temple. So if you haven't grown it outside the temple, you should really think about what you should do. Perhaps you should start growing the rice again. There was this big development program from the left front government in that near the village, which was going to include an airport there, not which would serve Sabrimala, but there was another reason. Further up the river, there used to be an annual convention of one of the denominations of the Syrio-Malabar Church, which was fairly large, but of course nothing like Sabrimala, but fairly large. And the opposition to that built up. We don't want an airport here. We don't want all the associated development here, which included resorts, convention centers, hotels, malls, and the usual other paraphernalia of this thing. Because that would have completely swamped the village, destroyed the wetland, and not only that, the construction of the airport would have required that the mast of the mandir, in Kerala the mandirs have very tall masts. They would want to have that mast cut down because it would interfere with the approach of the aeroplanes.
The Dwajastambha, you say, that should do that.
So naturally that incensed everybody. So the man who in fact galvanized this whole movement became a close friend. His name was Komunam ji. He is, he was at that time an RSS pracharak, and he used to also be a journalist. They had a newspaper, a Malayali newspaper there called Janmabhoomi. So he galvanized this, and the movement was generally successful. But while that was still a cloud and a question, they didn't cultivate rice because they thought, what's the point? This thing is going to be taken over, our wetland is going to be destroyed. let's not sow the rice and then see it destroyed, which was fair. So they stopped cultivation there for about 3 to 4 years while this movement was going on. But once that was settled, then they said that they have to bring this rice from there. And I thought this was a good time to give them a little nudge and say that perhaps you should put this back into cultivation, which they did eventually. They did the following year, they did. So these are the kind of stories that I would relate as part of my the training given to so-called training, in order to make it more earthy and more immediate. That we're talking about communities and their problems. We're not talking about UN and what they want.
Saving Ayurveda is not stopping its globalization. It is a very viable economic avenue that should be explored.
No, not only that, whichever Vaidyas I've had this discussion with, they say, look, if you follow the reason why we choose a certain, let's say, standard roster of herbals, of Ayurvedic herbals, of botanical herbals, it's based on where we are. So, for example, if you look at I have that bottle with me, the container with me, because I take the Kottakkal Chyawanprash. Now, the Kottakkal Chyawanprash, those 54 or 56 ingredients are not identical to, let's say, Chyawanprash, which is made by Navadarshanam, which is here in, I think, in Himachal or somewhere. So, some of those ingredients will differ naturally because the origin of your collecting points is different. Kottakkal will collect it from Nilgiri or Namalai. Here you will collect it from. So, what these Vaidyas said is that the principle of balance between ingredients that have particular uses or particular effects, therapeutic effects, that principle can be applied anywhere in the world. So even if you're in Greece or if you're in Libya or if you're in Bolivia, you can apply that principle provided you find herbals which have this curative and therapeutic effects. In fact, at that point, this was Vaidya Ramkumar. He is very close to us, to my wife and I, because we have, I was telling you about this Coimbatore place here, where our house is made of ram dirt over there. He was very keen that, look, let's not bound our Ayurvedic method only to Bharatvarsha. Because we are saying that, the entire world was in fact what we consider our Jambudvipa was everywhere, and so our methods were therefore everywhere. So let's not rob others of this opportunity. Let us in fact find ways to ensure the validity of our formulae and find ways perhaps to, as some others put it, earn or levy a royalty on their use.
Yes.
Which I thought is really an avenue worth exploring, provided we find ways to assure the purity and efficacy. So, whether the extreme commercialization of TCM has an effect on its efficacy and potency, I very much think it has had, not because I know anything about TCM, but because I've seen what it has done to their tea farms. Their Chinese tea is horrendously commercialized. I mean, you can't believe it. I've seen 2 or 3 of those tea farms. And the amount of pesticides that are poured into those is unbelievable. These are the messages that I would use instead and go on. This is also from the same, well, this is actually not the boat race. This is also on the Pamba. This is connected very much to that image of the mandir, the Parthasarathi mandir that I showed you earlier. Because on the Pamba there are 52 villages, each of which has this Paliodam, which have these oarsmen, and in fact they come to the mandir, each of them, over 2 or 3 days. This whole festival takes 2 or 3 days. They come to the mandir as an offering. And this is what I meant about, the respect and devotion to the living element of Jal. So Jal becomes their transport to Parthasarathi, and then they have the grand Valla Sadhya, which is the feast, which is then the Diksha. And one of the lessons that I would deliver from this is that the river is kept clean and in navigable order because of this, because they don't want to interrupt this. This has to be a free, continuous flow.